You're listening to Females in Fantasy, a podcast elevating the voices of women authors of science fiction and fantasy who write about kick-ass heroines. I am your host, Brianna Da Silva, and this is Season 2, Episode 2. Today, we are talking with Kameron Hurley, and there's a good chance you may have heard of at least one of her books, whether it's God's War, The Stars Are Legion, The Worldbreaker Saga, or The Geek Feminist Revolution. She and I are going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, female warriors, and the way that women in war and in all sorts of different aspects of society are often erased from our narratives. Before we get into that, though, I have a bit of a personal announcement. I am, to my surprise, an author. And I am not releasing the big fantasy novel that I have mentioned before. That is not anywhere close to being completed. But I have a little poetry book that is coming out. So I've referenced this before in past interviews. I know I definitely have in the one with Brianna Morgan. But about a year ago, I went through a major worldview change. And if any of you have ever gone through major worldview changes, you know that sometimes they can be pretty difficult. Sometimes not, but sometimes, they can be very turbulent, emotional, even traumatic experiences. And that was definitely the case for me. And related to that, I was figuring out that I was not exactly straight. And in order to process all those emotions, make sense of all these new paradigms, I ended up writing a bunch of poetry. Now, these poems were definitely very personal. I was never intending to share them, but there was something that I recognized, and that was that when I was going through that experience, it was very helpful for me to read stories of other people that had gone through similar things, and to hear from them. It kind of gave me, solidarity, a lot of comfort, gave me some hope, looking to the future, how it would look like on the other side, things like that. So I decided to take my poems and put them into a little book. In the event that they can, help other people maybe that are experiencing similar kind of things. And I recognize also that probably most of you don't care. This is, after all, a science fiction and fantasy podcast, not a poetry podcast. But I do know that based on some of the topics that we talk about and the audience that I know is listening, there will be at least a little bit of an overlap. So if that's something that if that sounds like your thing, the book is called A Canvas of Stars, and the ebook is available right now for pre-order on Amazon, and then it will be available also. The paperback version will both be out in just a few days, or depending on when you're listening to this, they may already be out. But yeah, so that's A Canvas of Stars, and I will include a link to that in the show notes. All right, well, let's get on with the interview. Here is my conversation with Kameron. Welcome, Kameron, to the Females in Fantasy show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. A little bit of a cold, a little bit of under the weather, but other than that, I have no complaints.
Well, colds are really annoying, but I'm glad that you have a good attitude about it. They usually make me pretty grumpy, but yeah. So I always start my interviews this way. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into writing initially, and then bring us to the present with the many, many books that you now have under your belt.
Well, my name, of course, is Kameron Hurley, and I actually write at CameronHurley.com. I've been blogging since about 2004, mostly writing reviews and rants about culture. And I've been writing forever. I've been writing since I was like 12. And I think I started submitting stories when I was 15, started selling in my late teens. And then I sold my first novel when I think I sold it when I was 27, but it didn't come out until I was 30 for many publishing reasons. And that was God's War. That's the first in the God's War trilogy. Released to Belgium Apocrypha now. I just had another collection of stories come out called Apocalypse Nyx. I've also written the Worldbreaker Saga, which is a epic fantasy series, which I'm finishing the last book right now. And The Stars Are Legion, which is this gooey space opera, which a lot of people refer to as lesbians in space because there are no male characters. It's all women giving birth to spaceships in space. So it's pretty fun. And I'm also quite well known for an essay called We Have Always Fought, which It's this bit of a historical essay about the sort of erasure of women in fighting roles throughout history, which is something I specialized in because I actually got my master's degree from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa, and I specialized in researching women in resistance movements. So I've been dealing with that stuff a long time. That's sort of my background academically, and then came to writing. Again, I was always going to be a writer, and I said, well, I don't want to necessarily get an English degree because I'll just read the same books I'm going to read anyway. I'd rather do history because history is full of amazing stories, like stuff that we couldn't even kind of come up with, on our own. So I should ask you, can I swear on this podcast or no?
You absolutely can.
Okay.
Yeah, there have been several authors already came in and started swearing.
So they already laid the groundwork for me.
They laid the ground. So I was like, all right, well, that's the kind of podcast it is now. I wasn't going to stop them.
Good to know. I was pausing, like, how much of myself should I be? So, okay, we're good.
Be your full self.
Excellent. So that's how I came to it. I just finished a book right now, a time traveling military science fiction novel. It's like Starship Troopers with time travel, and that's the Light Brigade, and that'll be out in March. So I'm a busy bee. I got so much going on.
You really are.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, and so the essay that you mentioned, that we have always fought, that was one of the main topics that I wanted to talk with you about. And I thought one of the things that's like a cool little trivia about that was that it was the first article to ever win a Hugo Award. Is that correct?
It was, yeah. It was the first blog post, first article length work that ever was nominated for and won a Hugo Award.
Yeah. And so it's in the Geek Feminist Revolution, but it's also online, and I'll include the link for anyone that hasn't read it yet. But yeah, there's this interesting kind of thing that happens with language about specifically about people who fight, where we have warriors and female warriors, soldiers and female soldiers. I have a kind of a story about this. I had a friend once, and just in case he's listening, I want to make sure I make it clear that I like this guy a lot and I have a lot of respect for him. But he said this one thing that was kind of funny to me once, where he was like, "You like female warriors, right?" And I was like, "Huh?" Like I didn't really understand the question. Like I'm really, fascinated by combat, and I like the idea of being a warrior. I like to fight. I think it's fun. And I'm a female, so I can relate to other ones that are females more. I don't know. It's almost like saying like, if I was really into farming, if like I had this like farm, little farm and outside or something, I had a garden or something, and I'd like to read about farming, and then someone's like, "You like female farmers, right?" I'm like,
right, exactly. Yeah.
It's like this. It's like warriors, and then there are female warriors, or this other category for some reason. But yeah, why is it that when we say just warriors or just soldiers, that it's assumed that we're talking about men?
I think it comes back to the patriarchal culture that we live in. We live in a society where, for quite a very long time, until very recently, in the past couple of decades, really, where people would use the word "he" to mean everyone. And of course, Ursula Le Guin famously said, well, the problem with that is, then you get to write something like she did in Left Hand of Darkness, which is the king is pregnant. And for her, she was like, it kind of pointed out kind of the absurdity of that, of saying, well, what is he? And when we say he, we don't mean someone who can get pregnant. We mean he, we mean him, we mean man, we mean men. And that sort of bringing that to the fore and making that very clear was, again, it goes back to the, so again, that's why it's called, we've always fought the women, cattle, and slaves narrative, right? There's this idea that women and slaves and cattle were all kind of bunched up into this property thing. And the problem is, you go back into the record, you go back far enough and, you get some more equality. And of course, we're back from many different cultures, there's matriarchies, there's different things. But from sort of Western cultural tradition that we come from, you see a lot of erasure of when, women were equal or women were in charge. And there's this kind of perpetual thing where people think, okay, well, men are the ones who did things. Men are the ones who history are about. And so that it just sort of ends up being how we think of people who do things. We say doctor. I think a lot of people even now will think of a man, especially a white man, when they think of the term doctor. And that goes back, it's intrinsic to how we learn language. And I remind people of that all the time because, there's so many internal biases we have and we get upset saying, well, I'm not sexist, I'm not racist. Well, you were raised in a racist, sexist culture. It started with language. And what you were shown, this is a police officer, and police officers are good. This is a doctor, and a doctor is a white man. That's how we learn that language. So a lot of like growing up and becoming woke, I guess, is what the kids say these days, is this idea of understanding that the things that we were taught to be absolutes and taught to be correct and true are much more complicated than that. They're much more interesting than that. Again, there's not just a he and a she. In many other cultures, and in our culture, there are actually a multiplicity of genders. And that's not a new thing. That's just something that I think, was very much suppressed, especially look at the 50s, whereas like in the post World War II, there was a very repressive era. We're just sort of kind of coming out of that and getting a backlash then against coming out of that. As with all of these things, time is a circle. So it's very much a language issue. It is breaking down the world into he and she, which is, of course, a false dichotomy. It's a false binary. There aren't even, just he and she. But we still have this thing. There are men and there's everyone else. And that's simply what we see in a lot of our language and culture and literature. Someone once, one of my history teachers explained history this way. She said, life is like a train. It's like people get on and off the train at different points. And so we witness different things. But it's like there's a culture, right, on the train. Like people say, you pick up your trash, you talk low, and you don't, like, there are these rules and social mores that you figure out as you get on and off the train. But as new people come on the train, they change those things. Hey, actually it's okay. This is the quiet car, and and they change, and then it shifts, and then someone else gets on the train, and that's a lot of what history is. It's a constant rewriting, and I think some people get very scared where they think that it's all been set in stone, it's all been this way forever, and in fact it hasn't. It's all made up, and it's all completely in flux and changing all the time.
I love that metaphor. That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what you said kind of already answers the question I was about to ask, but there might be a little bit of some more dynamics, so I'll just ask it anyway. But so we know, like as you were mentioning, that women have been doing all the things throughout history. Anytime the men are doing something, you'll find at least one woman doing it somewhere, and often a lot of them. But sometimes, in some cases, there are men that are doing things more often than women, such as like being in war or ruling kingdoms or whatever. But you mentioned in your essay that like in revolutionary armies, you'll often find about 20 to 30% of the forces will be women, which actually was like a higher percentage than I expected. But yeah, why is it the fact that in some cases women do tend to be in the minority? Is it a simple like overlooking of a minority that leads to us like assuming that all these people are men, or is there more going on beyond just kind of the things that you already talked about with language and whatnot?
There is an active rewriting that happens after all of these movements. There's a wonderful book about women in World War II, Russian women. It was so bad. I mean, Russia was awful. It was horrific, the things that went on there. And women, even it was life or death. It was survival. They were much closer to 40-50% of some of these forces because it was do or die. And what they talked about is this wonderful oral history of women, fighting during World War II. And they say, on the front lines, when we were there with the guys, it's like, there was initial, pushback, like we had to prove, of course, always that we can do it and it's fine. And they were excellent snipers, excellent tank operators, women were doing everything. And they said, once we finally kind of got their respect, it became a lot easier. But the problem was, after the war, no woman wanted to say that she was part of the war because they looked upon those women as being whores, as being sluts, as being women that you don't want to settle down and have children with. They reminded men too much of the war. And they wanted a softer, they wanted this idyllic, oh, we want to come home to quote unquote these real women and these stories, right? The stories we were told of what, and it was I read this and it was just the most heart-wrenching thing to read these women being equals and fighting next to these people and really proving themselves and trying to come back and have a family and to have, people just freaking out. And this happened in the US as well. There was some moral panic about, it became a rumor that there was an entire ship full of US nurses who had gotten pregnant, overseas and were coming back to the US. Yeah, it was like, oh, if your daughter goes off to war, she'll, as a nurse, she'll be pregnant, and they're all whores. So it was this whole panic about this. And again, it was this whole idea that there are certain types of women. The nice girls stay at home and they do what they're supposed to do. And the girls who are not so nice and not the ones that you marry, those are the ones who go out into the big wide world and have adventures. And that was something that, especially once everybody came back, they started to not talk about the things they had done during the war, for that very reason, which is just kills me, it destroys me. But, and that's how it gets erased every time. And it's erased every time. So every time it comes up and everybody steps up and they do their part and then they go, okay, now, and this happened in South Africa as well. And they did a really great job actually of not going quietly. South African women actually came in and said, hey, with the African National Congress, once Mandela, came into office, they said, hey, you promised us 50% of the seats in the parliament. We're going to go to women. And the guys were like, ha, 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 ha. And so the women sat for 3 days or something inside of parliament singing freedom songs until they finally got 30% is what they agreed on. But there were lots of things where people told them, and I read this again in when I'm doing my research for women in resistance fighters in South Africa. They said it was such a struggle because everyone would tell you, just put up with the sexism because we're all working together for this greater good, right? After we've achieved, freedom, then we'll work on sexism. And it never turned out that way, right? It was always like, you need to, suppress this other thing that you want in order for the greater good. It's always women, right? Who have to make these sacrifices for the greater good. And then the war is over and they just want to, again, hey, now there's just different people in power and we go back to the same status quo. Changing the world is hard. Changing the world is really hard. And now that said, all it takes is a small group of people, right? A small group of people who's passionate and loud enough. I think, you can see it happen in real time, but it is very difficult to enact a sort of change that happens across many generations. And again, it's to me, it's very willful. It was very willful. Also, I think you see it in the United States where they would even bring out, the scientists in their lab coats and the doctors saying how wonderful it was for children, for women to work. They said this in the 1940s, and all these studies about how great it was because they needed people to work in the factories because all the men were at war. And as soon as the men came home, all the same doctors came out and said how terrible it was for women to be working and that children needed someone to stay at home. I mean, it was blatant. It was blatant propaganda. So again, propaganda is my one of my I'm just fascinated by it, which is why it's a strange time to be alive. But I just found that amazing that they would just turn around and say, well, now that's not in the best interest of the state. And so we want to, change the narrative again. So yes, you had all these women who, were welders and fighter pilots and all of these things who, were just sort of expected to go home and give up all their jobs to men who were less qualified because those men deserve it. They worked really hard, and they had no, experience as a welder, but they went to war. And she's just like, what? Anyway. Oh, so yeah, I see that across cultures. So yeah.
That's making me frustrated even just
yes, right? Oh my gosh.
Oh man. Yeah. So there are certain kinds of narratives that we keep telling about women, even though they don't reflect the real women we might know in real life. And by narratives, I mean narratives that we might tell in fictional stories. The female character is portrayed as being the weak one, the quiet one, the passive one. the one that needs to be rescued and defended by the big strong men, or one of my least favorite ones, the less knowledgeable one who all the men have to teach. Like sometimes even like it's so rare to have a female mentor, right? Even sometimes you have like a little teenage girl who has her like her little teenage male interest, and the male interest is always the one that's telling her how to do all the things, because I guess girls don't know anything, right? But you know, I know for myself, these kind of like tropey things that we often see in movies and in books, like are not reflections of the real women that I know in real life. And there's a quote that you had in the essay where you said, "The women in my family were the hardworking matriarchs, but the stories I saw on TV and movies, and even in many books, said they were anomalies." So then on the other hand, if you go and actually write women in realistic ways, then people will tell you, ironically, they'll complain that it isn't realistic. So why is that? Why do we keep seeing these tropes rather than like writing more from our actual experience and from like actual real life?
There's a thing that we do when we're very young, and it's how we learn how to do anything, right? Like, you know, your mom loads the dishwasher, you pretend to be cooking while your mom cooks, pretend to mow the lawn, you know, the little bubble mower. There were things, we do those things through mimicry, right? And when I started to try to become a writer, I would mimic, right? I would mimic the stuff that I'd read. So I would write about a lot of white men. That's what I wrote about when I was just 11, 12. And yeah, it was there. Yeah, sure. There would be a heroine, and, you know, she would be cool and stuff, but also, you know, most of it was about dudes would be around her. She had like no female best friends or anything. And I did write quite a few with like male protagonists, and I never really thought that was weird until, I started traveling, I think in my early 20s, because I was in a very small kind of, rural town. All I knew about the world was the little town I lived in. And of course, which I knew was not representative of the world. So what else do I have of the world? Oh, I have books, and I have movies, I have media, right? That's how we learn. Stories are how we learn about the world. Stories are how we learn what behavior is okay, what traits are okay, what we should strive for, what we should aspire to. That's all you have. And until I was able to start really traveling my late teens, early 20s, I didn't know, right? Is my family an anomaly? Is I didn't have like a huge social network. I was from a small town. And again, this was pre-social media and all that too. But yeah, I think what you end up doing is emulating what you see every day. And which is one of the things I tell a lot of people, especially if they're from, you know, smaller towns, to read widely and travel as much as you possibly can. I think I saw my first Pride parade when I was 20, and I was like, what the hell is this? This is amazing. You know, like, holy shit. And to not have experienced or seen that, so, you know, the energy and people just so happily celebrating and being themselves and living in different ways, like it doesn't really click for you until you actually get to see it. And this is actually why I'm so passionate about writing the sorts of stories that I write, because if we cannot see something, if we cannot imagine something, it's very difficult to bring that into being, right? One of the things that I would always do is go to the back of the books that I had read, and I would read the about the author page and about all their adventures, all the cool jobs they've had, and how they've traveled. And I was like, that's what I want to be. You know, I was like, I want to travel. I want to have written a lot of stuff. I want to win awards. I want to have lots of different experiences. I was like, that's what I would really like to do. And it was from, you know, you go around and you look into the world and you say, well, what's out there? What can I be? And it's very difficult when what you see is, you know, well, guys can be Indiana Jones, but, you know, you need to be the dancer who breaks her nail and freaks out. And I rejected that for a long time. Like, well, I'm not a woman because that's what women are, right? And I was like, that can't be me. I'm a human. And it was really frustrating until I finally started to see some representations of women that were, hey, you don't have to get married and have kids. Hey, you can travel the world and maybe have a partner later, or a few partners of whatever gender. That really wasn't so much an option. Like everybody I knew when I was younger was, you know, again, the women in my family are wonderful matriarchs, but they all got married and they all had kids. and they hated it a lot of times. They clearly should have probably chosen another path. But that's what I saw, and that so until I saw something else, it was very difficult to imagine ways that it could be. But again, that's why I have problems with some of the canon books that everybody teaches, like these, like saying, hey, these are all the books everyone should know. Well, the problem is they all perpetuate very, very specific political and social goals. And they say certain things are normal and okay, and certain things are not. There's also very much normalization of crazy psychopathic men, white men in particular, in a lot of these stories, where I'm like, it makes us much more forgiving of this sort of psychopathic behavior. So it does not surprise me a lot of times when I see us that in the real world go, oh, well, it was just this one time that he was a crazy psychopath. Oh, and those other 63 times. Well, we've been nurtured, right? We've been shown these stories that, but a woman goes crazy once it's, yellow wallpaper and just lock her up, So we don't have a multiplicity of stories to kind of use to gauge our lives, and to formulate our lives in different ways. So that's one of the reasons I try to write as many crazy stories as I can.
Oh, I know, right? So sometimes even women, we fall into these tropes where we're like even though like again, like even though like we should know better, and like as you already were talking about that, like we still like we mimic, and even when it like represents ourselves and our own gender in like negative ways, and that can be really hard to unlearn. So on a practical level, like in your own writing, what are some ways that you have combated that and like gotten out of those habits? Or is that still a work in progress?
I think internalized misogyny is always going to be a work in progress, because I catch myself thinking things all the time. And one of those is thinking things, about strong, arrogant women being like, and then saying, okay, step back, Cameron. If this was a dude, what would you think? We're like, well, I would think they were brilliant and just really passionate about their job. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay. It happens to me all the time, and I have to stop myself, because I know where those negative thoughts are coming from. And in fact, I had this conversation with a female colleague a little while back, and she was a hard ass. She knew exactly what she wanted. And I didn't mind working with her because she would tell me what she wanted. Like, I was like, that's great. I don't have to guess. It's not but man, like, she's like, I've had guys walk out. She's like, they just walk out and they just don't come back. And I was talking with her and the boss, and I said, you know what? Like, if you were like, think of Steve Jobs, right? Like, what an asshole that guy is. And people start talking about he's so brilliant and so wonderful. And man, women cannot get away with that shit. They just can't, because guys flip the fuck out, and they walk out. And it's very interesting to me, the ways that, again, these expectations we have for female behavior that we do not have for male behavior. And yes, would it be great if we were all just nice, wonderful, happy-go-lucky people? Sure. But it also,
there's call for that though.
Exactly. But sometimes it's, hey, you fucked up. Don't do that again. And that should be okay to say. I actually was telling my spouse the other day, I said, well, I had to deploy the smiley face. I was pissed off. Because man, if I have to use a smiley face in something, that is me being like, I'm going to reach through this freaking computer and claw your eyes out because you're so freaking stupid. But you put the smiley, like, okay, just would be really great if you followed up. Smiley face, you haven't heard from him in 3 weeks. Your boss is on your case. You've been asking them like 40 times for something. Like when you deploy that, like that's the bomb. But like, again, we can't say like, hey, I've been waiting on this for 3 weeks and I followed up with you 3 times and this needs to be done. No smiley face. Because you'd be like, well, what a bitch, when in fact we're just being professional. And it is. I mean, I see myself doing the same thing. So I totally get that. One of the things I did that I felt really helped actually was writing my first novel, God's War, where, most of the men were off fighting a war. And so like 80 to 90% of all of the secondary characters had to be female. And it actually really taught me a lot about my default biases. because like all the tavern, the innkeepers, the rickshaw drivers, the clerks, the tax people, like every single person that she would run into, that the characters would run into, would need to be a woman. And as I started to write it that way, I realized how often I would just default to a dude. And you had these sorts of behaviors that you would assume, okay, well, it's the clerk. And you were just like, well, it's the clerk. And this clerk is also a woman. And it's a mercenary. And this mercenary is also a woman. Because they have to be for the story. That's the way that it is. Stars Are Legion, same way. There are literally no men in the book. It's parthenogenesis. The ship decides what it needs, and they give birth to the things that it needs. So every single person, every single living thing inside of these massive world ships is all female. That's never commented on. It's just the way the world is. And it goes a long way to like hacking my own brain, because it forces me to think about humans and women humans, again, humans who are women, in a way that I have not been forced to do. I've not been immersed in my own life. We talk about this a lot. Why do men seem to know so very, very little about women? Women know so much about men. Well, literally, men can go through their entire professional lives, not understanding menstruation. And that's fine, right? Like it's not going to impact them in any way. Not knowing how to speak to a woman in a professional manner may eventually catch up to them, but probably not. Let's be real. Whereas if women can go into an office and they don't understand things about men, they're not going to get very far, because men are in charge of all of the, a lot of the really big structures and businesses and things in our lives. We have to learn about men as a coping mechanism, as a survival thing, whereas men don't need to learn. And they can just kind of float through life and be like, whatever, gosh, I don't know why you're so upset that you've worked all day and that the house is a mess and now you have to do all these things as well, because you're a woman. Don't women just do that? Like there's no understanding for a lot of people. It is changing, but I think about that quite a lot. Is like, you only learn about the things that are intrinsic to your survival, and women have to learn to read men because men can kill them. There's a good I think that not only can they kill them and hurt them, but that they'll get away with it, as we've seen. You can get killed or hurt in terrible ways, and dudes get away with it because you'll be framed as this, whatever it is, it's always your fault. And we know that. We've known that from the time we're very young, whereas guys don't understand because they've never actually had to think about that and to deal with that. So I spend a lot of time kind of immersing myself on purpose in these all-female worlds, not just because they exist in the world, because they make me a better person, and they make me more empathetic, not only again to other women, but to myself, to be frank. I think there's so many times where, you kind of look out into the world and you go, what can I do? And the truth is that, it's unlimited. It's limited only by our imaginations, but sometimes it doesn't feel that way. Sometimes it can really get you down. So I definitely write this stuff for myself as much as anyone.
That is a really great tone to start to wrap this conversation up with. But before I let you go, tell us about your latest release, Apocalypse Nyx, and the very not a cannibal llama protagonist, which to the listeners, you'll understand why I'm talking about cannibal llamas if you read her essay. But yeah, tell us about that book.
Yeah, Apocalypse Nyx is about a badass bisexual bounty hunter on a crazy secondary world planet. She has like this ragtag firefly band of messed up people she runs around with, and there's bug magic, and there's this war that's been going on for hundreds of years. I think I call it like Mad Max in space. She chops off heads. It's wonderful. And it's actually 5 shorter novella short stories featuring this team, and they're all kind of these distinct individual adventures that they all go on. So it's actually a really great primer. Like if you think you might enjoy the God's War novels, which are basically her and her team going on, again, longer, crazier adventures. it's a really great way to sort of dive in and immerse yourself again in this world where all the men go to war. So women kind of rule the world, for better or worse in this particular case.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. How can people keep up with you and follow your work?
A great way to see what's going on is to go to CameronHurley.com, and that's Cameron with a K. And if you go to CameronHurley.com//newsletter, you can actually sign up for a newsletter and get all of the great stuff about new releases and everything right into your inbox. I'm also quite frequent on Twitter, and I'm Cameron at Kameron Hurley on Twitter.
Aren't we all?
Mm-hmm. To our detriment, yeah.
Yeah. Always trying to be on there a little bit less. That's like the perpetual goal.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, and you have a good one.
Thanks, you too.
All right, that was my conversation with Kameron. And if you want to hear more from Kameron, we have another extended conversation talking about some of the cultures in her Worldbreaker saga, which include a couple of matriarchies. And we also dispel the myth that, the whole more than two genders thing is a modern Western invention, which it is not. But yeah, we talk about all that in the Patreon exclusive extended interview, which you can listen to over at patreon.com/females in fantasy. Next time on the podcast, I will be inviting on April Daniels, author of Dreadnought and Sovereign, and she will be talking about the topic of transgender characters, so get ready for that one. If you are not subscribed yet to the Females in Fantasy podcast, you can find it on SoundCloud, Google Play, iTunes, and all the other apps that iTunes populates. So pretty much all the places. But yeah, so subscribe if you haven't already so that you won't miss an episode. And if you'd like to help it grow, please rate and review on iTunes. That helps me a lot. This has been the Females in Fantasy podcast. I am Brianna Da Silva. Thanks for listening.